Once that starts, I'll get the music started. Once that starts, I'll Hello, everyone. Today is Saturday, December 1st, 2018. I'm Bob Diebold, Vice Chairman for the Committee for the Global Endeavor. Today is the second in a series of webinars on the topic of comparing and contrasting the true teachings of Jesus with the traditional tenets and practices of organized institutional Christianity. It is topic 8 in the study guide called Revelation Revealed. Its author and chairman of the committee is Neil Waldrop, for whom I am turning the facilitation of this webinar over to right now. Neil.
Once again, I am delighted to be here. I think we had a very interesting discussion last week, and I am confident that it will be equally interesting this week. For viewers who subsequently view in YouTube, I strongly recommend that if you do not have the document Revelation Revealed available to you, that you instead proceed to download it from the Committee for the Global Endeavor's website. The citation is as follows: www.globalendeavor.net. Global Endeavor is treated as one word. I say again, www.globalendeavor.net. The document Revelation Revealed is near the bottom of the homepage. I should say a link to it. Now, we are, as Bob announced, continuing our discussion of topic 8 in the document Global Endeavor, entitled Comparing and Contrasting the True Teachings of Jesus with the Traditional Tenets and Practices of Organized Institutional Christianity. The first few pages of that topic are extremely dense in the sense that they correlate with fundamental parts of Christianity that are deep and deeply entrenched. Therefore, our discussion last week was proceeding rather slowly through the document, and indeed that will be the case this week. Now, because this week there are only 4 of us, I will take a more active role in the discussion than I did last week when we had 6 people. My general practice is largely to rely on all the other participants to comment and seldom, if ever, express my own opinion. This week, I will have to express my own opinion from time to time. Because the viewing screen in YouTube is not really an interactive screen, there is no possibility of posing questions that would reach us during the time that you are watching in YouTube. On the other hand, you have the option, if you wish, of sending a written question that we would consider perhaps and discuss at a later time. And you would do that by sending an email message to the standard email address that is identified at the bottom of the homepage on the website of the Committee for the Global Endeavor. That email address is as follows: info@globalendeavor.net. Now, we reserve the right to edit your questions if we decide to use them, and in all likelihood, we would combine several questions together for the purposes of some discussion in a future program. Having said all of the above, which essentially amounts to a procedural introduction to the program today, I would now like to begin the substantive discussion that we will have. And for those of you who are looking at the text of Revelation Revealed, I specify that we are now at the bottom of page 89, specifically in the 2 paragraphs at the bottom of that page that are headed Christianity, How It Evolved. I read these 2 paragraphs at the very end of our broadcast last week. We did not have the time to discuss them, and therefore, for the purposes of comprehensibility and coordination, I would go ahead and read them again. Christianity, How It Evolved. Although the context of our discussion does not and should not enable us to rival histories of Christianity whose detailed narrative and scholarly analysis extend for over 1,000 pages, we can examine certain highlights that will suffice for our purposes here. From an historical perspective, the fundamental reality that we must grasp and absorb is that, quote, Christianity is an extemporized religion, unquote. The Midweir Commission, paper 195, section 10, paragraph 18. As the Midweir Commission points out, lest there be any hesitation about what this means and implies, let me paraphrase this thought in ways that are colloquial and very clear. They made it up as they went along. Of course, we must now explain that the word they refers to Christian leaders and theologians, that the word it stands for Christianity. Given these minor clarifications, the sentence may seem shocking, at least to some persons who encounter it for the first time. Therefore, I believe it is wise to intensify the reader's awareness by reiterating what I just said. They made it up as they went along. Yes, they definitely did. So I would pose the question to my 3 colleagues today. Is it fair to say that they made it up as they went along is an accurate paraphrase of the idea expressed by the Midweir Commission, quote, Christianity is an extemporized religion, unquote. Bob, would you try that first?
Sure. Thanks, Neil. Just to clarify the word extemporize, there's a couple other maybe synonyms that might make sense here. Ad lib, improvise. So improvise comes to me forefront quickly. You know, I think of a jazz ensemble. They have to improvise as things are happening. Someone may play a tune or a theme or something, or even the audience may cause a jazz band to improvise or to extemporize what they're doing, and that's the strength of a jazz band. Now, I'm not saying Christianity from the first century to the 20th century or 21st century is like a jazz band, but as conditions were changing, this is how I perceive these things were going on. Paul, for example, when he went to the Corinthians, or when he went to any of the pagans, for example, or any of the Gentiles, and began preaching, he had to make concessions. I can only imagine, trying to get in front of whatever size crowd he was there, and someone would say, well, what do you do for sacrifice? What do you do for, Sunday? And to have to make it up, have to extemporize, to improvise. Paul had to act, as did some of the other apostles, of course, except for Abner. That they're part of this jazz band, so to speak, and I've got to make it believable, compatible with what I'm facing, and I've got to incorporate some of these principles, doctrines, dogma, even, and any considerations that came into him externally. So that's how I see it happening. Hope that provides a little juices for the other two gentlemen.
I'd like to probe a little bit in regard to what you just said. In effect, much of what I heard from you was, in effect, sympathy with their situation, the situation of the early apostles and leaders, and understanding why they had to make it up. But you agree, nevertheless, that they did make it up, and that making it up is what they did. Yes?
Absolutely. You nailed that right on the head. I do have some sympathy for, here's these first century, fairly, some of them were very intelligent, some of them were very common, and thrust upon, having to take these more simplified but complex and in juxtaposition to the current first century belief in religion and practices. And they were facing that at the very same time. It's almost like you're going into a marketing pitch, and you're taking your product out there, and you have no anticipation, you anticipate that there's going to be some questions, but you have no idea when some of these things pop out there about your product set. I hate to make it sound secular here, but this is pretty much what Paul and others were actually doing. I use Paul as the example here because he's essentially, quote unquote, marketing the gospel to those who hadn't heard it before.
Thank you, Bob. I will now turn to the next person, in this case, Charles. Please express your views of this idea about the early leaders of Christianity making up their teachings, making up the religion as they went along. Charles?
Well, I think it's a reasonable generalization. And I say that because most human behavior over time evolves in this way. I don't think per se it disparages Christianity to suggest they made it up as they went along, an idea. This is natural to human behavior. And it'd be no different from the Christian story or any other story on any other subject or any other dimension. It was necessary. I've spoken many times before all kinds of different audiences, principally about history, but other subjects as well, and one never can anticipate all the questions that one's going to receive. Some will be a complete surprise. And in effect, Paul and other Christian missionaries, teachers, were attempting to formulate ideas that either were on or could be placed on a policy level, a religious policy level. But it's perfectly natural. However disquieting it may be to some, This is largely how humans behave in the evolutionary context. We are evolutionary creatures, after all.
I think that you, like Bob, in effect have expressed a degree of sympathy and understanding for the psychological and perhaps logical requirements that applied to the early Christians, at least the early Christian leaders. But now, would you please consider the implications of what you have said and what Bob said for subsequent claims that Christianity in whatever century may have been the century in which someone was speaking was exactly the teachings of Jesus as Jesus had left it to the apostles? How do you evaluate that statement?
Are you asking me?
Yes, I am.
Well, as time went on, much of institutionalized Christianity became increasingly different from the gospel of Jesus, even profoundly so. The Evangelist makes a distinction between the religion of Jesus and a religion or religions about Jesus. And that's the essential difference. That is a pivot upon which all kinds of ideas were added that were not taught by Jesus. For instance, Jesus really did believe in the spiritual equality of humanity, of each individual person, including the juxtaposition of male and female, men and women. And to a very large extent in the Christian story, that got lost. And instead, the opposite occurred. And there are a number of other examples, many examples. But it is natural, and Jesus did the best he could given the material he worked with, the apostles and others. It would be interesting if one could trace a more exacting history of the women's core that Jesus established. But it seems, from an historical point of view, the long view, to have faded away like an echo.
There is a statement, I think, in one of the quotations that we will read in a later page, that the Apostle Paul conceded this in principle, but he found it very difficult in practice to accept that women had an equal role in regard to the spiritual observance of Jesus' teachings. And perhaps by the time that became clear to Paul, the women's core had faded away already. I don't know. Steve, I'd like to turn to you now for your general observation on the principal question, but also any comments you may have on anything that one of the others of us has said in the interim.
Well, the statement, they made it up as they went along. I have trouble really understanding what that is supposed to indicate. It's somewhere between a truism and a non sequitur. Of course, they made it up as they went along, and that's what the relators expect us to do. They expect us to take the truth that's presented to us through revelation, and based on our spiritual experience and cultural backgrounds, those spiritual truths, those revelatory truths, get adapted to the human condition as it's found by religious proponents. So as Bob said, it's completely natural, it's expected by the relators. Paper 87 talks about how be worthy of its name has to grow naturally, organically, and unconsciously. If that's what you mean by they made it up as they went along, then that's what the relators expect and for, is that religion will grow naturally out of the spiritual. So it's not surprising, it's expected, and it's actually desired by the relators. So I don't see where the scandal is in all this. They had their Jewish roots in religion, and they took their religious experience, like on Pentecost, and they had to make converts. That was what they were initially supposed to do. And in order to make converts, you have to tell a story. And they told a story, and that story is what made converts. the teaching, there are two parts of Christianity. There was what's called kerygma, which was the gospel message, which was the short story about Jesus' life and what he did. And then there was the long story, which is the teachings of Jesus, which we can get in later. But when they proclaimed Jesus, they proclaimed what they called the kerygma, which was the gospel message, which is intended to market, as Bob would say. That was the marketing message. But there's also a teaching message where they taught the ethics of Jesus. So and that was done in a separate context.
I understand what you've said, and I think all three of you in different ways have basically commented that it was natural for this evolutionary process to occur in regard to Christianity as it is developed. Now, I remind you, however, that the topic that we are discussing, the overarching topic, is comparing and contrasting the true teachings of Jesus with the traditional tenets and practices of organized institutional Christianity. And I maintain that even though you are correct in saying that what happened is not a scandal as such, it does represent a process, an evolutionary process that continually moved farther and farther away from the true teachings of Jesus into an institutionalized version that the followers made up as they went along. I wonder now if anyone has further comment in regard to the general topic. You can react to what I just said, or you can add something further if you wish. Bob, do you have anything further to add?
I do, Neil. I got thinking about this jazz band thing, and I hadn't, had that in my thoughts until we started to talk here today. And of course, the idea that you're going to be totally unfamiliar potentially with, who the audience is. And as far as I understand, I'm not a jazz band player. I do enjoy jazz, but what I do understand is that the audience plays a particular role in some of the way that a particular song could be sound a little bit different, have different things. A saxophone could pick something up from the audience and then make the change, or cause the group to actually make the change and interrelate. The thought I had about all of that is that when does it become a problem? And I don't think I have an answer for the jazz band problem, but they can get into an unharmonious or they could go so far away from what the intended music was supposed to be that it may not sound very good. And I think it requires skill, fortitude to try to stick with what you've actually got, what the actual theme of the music or of the piece is supposed to portray. So, to kind of get to the not quite a scandal side, but where did it, when does, I'll pose the question, when does the jazz band get too far out of sync that it becomes a real serious problem to, what the message or to what the music really was trying to portray?
I understand what you've said, and I don't find anything in it that really involves a contradiction. But part of my comment, part of my question, part of the reason for the words on the page has to do with the fact that in carrying out his seventh bestowal on Urantia, Jesus of Nebadon, the human incarnation of Christ Michael, had certain purposes. He was the bestowal son. He was conveying a message. And the consequence of evolutionary changes to that message, in some cases ignoring it, in some cases contradicting it, vitiated the degree to which Michael's bestowal on Urantia in the human form of Jesus of Nazareth has so far achieved the purpose that he intended. Now, one can say, well, we've had only 2,000 years, give it a fair chance, maybe it will. And that's a reasonable point, because human beings do evolve, society evolves, understanding evolves. And I would submit to you that the Urantia book, the more complete and more accurate account of Jesus's true teachings, is part of the correction that will influence humanity in the long run. Steve, for you now, the opportunity to make additional comments.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I don't think there's any doubt that the message of Jesus as he taught it was distorted immediately and subsequently afterwards. I don't think that came to us as a surprise to anybody, including Jesus. He did the best he could, and he realized that it's entering into his teachings are entering into the evolutionary stream, and things are going to get changed. And I think the people in charge upstairs realize that too, and the Urantia book is a corrective, and hopefully it will take part. But I want to say something about the implication of saying they made it up as they went along. Well, like improvisation, a good improviser has a huge amount of experience and musical knowledge on which he bases his improvisation. And so the apostles, for instance, had their Jewish religion, their Jewish customs, their Jewish beliefs, as well as the teachings of Jesus under their belts, as well as their experience on Pentecost. And all those things came together and produced with the beginnings of Christianity. So I think it's misleading to say they made it up as they went along. They certainly didn't make it up, out of the blue sky. They used their experience and their knowledge and their traditions in order to convey Jesus' message as best they could. So I don't really like that phrase, they made it up as they went along. I think it's very misleading.
I understand your point, and I will concede that they did not make up all the sayings of Jesus that they attribute to him correctly. I believe, however, that they made up the theological implications that they chose to attach to those memories. And in that regard, I think it is fair to say that they made up the religion of Christianity as they went along. Charles?
Well, I think it's a very apt thesis. That is, they made it up as they went along thesis. I think it's quite apt. So I differ from Stephen. With regards to apply that point in regard to the Urantia book, I would distinguish, based on, I want to comment on what Stephen had observed, I would distinguish between essentially forms and substance. I think we are free as mortals to take the fifth epochal revelation and experiment with many forms concerning prayer, worship, and other kinds of social arrangements, provided we don't damage the notion of unity and don't foster intellectual and spiritual uniformity, provided that those criteria are met. In regard to the substance, no, I don't think we have carte blanche or the freedom to apply our free will to make up things as we go along. For instance, in the gospel of Jesus, personal religion is paramount. We're not at liberty, in my opinion, with regard to the Urantia book, to essentially alter that, to make up something, to replace it with something else. However, this is what happened in the early years of Christianity and then subsequently for 2,000 years. They did exactly that. They made up things they went along. Again, that's quite natural for people to do, but it's not necessarily wise. It certainly is not accurate. If people, I'll give you an example, in a Baptist service in the American South, many prayers are sung to the tune of an organ or a piano. The pianist or the player is at liberty to change the song or the tune or put some adjustment or some change to it as the service goes along. The player has that liberty to do that if he or she is moved by the Spirit. That's the logic behind that. But not the substance in terms of encouraging worship as they understand it. Now, with the Urantia book, again, the substance of the teachings in the Urantia book, from page 1 to 2097, I think are meant to be held intact. I think that's the reason the revelation came in book form, for the very purpose, express purpose of trying to make it more, to make it easier in the evolution of this revelation, as human beings respond to it with one experience after another, to keep to the correction, if you will. And I mentioned personal religion because it's supremely important. It's of supreme value. If we were to, in the future, favor some kind of authority or ecclesiastical structure, not just in form, say, for administrative purposes, but the theological substance, the spiritual substance, I think that would be an error. And it would be most unfortunate. So I distinguish generally between forms and substance in regard to the thesis. They made it up as they went along, as it applies to us today. But in Christianity, even though it's natural for people to do what they did in terms of contingencies and adjustments of all kinds, they went very, very far afield. I only use one example. There are numerous examples. The one concerning the status of women, that's a very significant example because it compartmentalizes humanity, or it attempts to compartmentalize humanity before God when you relegate women even to silence, to dictate that they're supposed to be silent, no less. And only men have the liberty to talk. That I think is a very serious breach, as an example. One example, serious breach from the living gospel that Jesus taught and exemplified.
Thank you. I believe we've talked about this at considerable length, and I believe very usefully also. There are differences of opinion among the four of us. I would stress that that is natural, that our purpose here is not to try to reach some lowest common denominator, not to enforce a common view, not to encourage uniformity, but rather to demonstrate that pluralism and diversity are inherent in the teachings of the Urantia book, and that each person reading it, each believer, has a perfect right to his or her own interpretation. Now, having reaffirmed that, which has been a characteristic of all our broadcasts, not only these broadcasts via Zoom and YouTube, but also the broadcasts that we previously conducted via audio only under the aegis of Cosmic Citizen. I would now like to continue on at the top of page 90 of Revelation Revealed and ask Steve to read the initial paragraph of heading A Religion About Jesus and the first quotation consisting of two paragraphs. Are you able to do that from the screen, Steve? Okay.
Yes.
Please.
A religion about Jesus. Starting on the day of Pentecost, the teachings of Jesus suddenly mutated into a religion about Jesus. Peter unintentionally led the way, but the others appear to have followed his example without hesitation or delay. The apostles had been in hiding for 40 days. This day happened to be the Jewish festival of Pentecost, and thousands of visitors from all parts of the world were in Jerusalem. Many arrived for this feast, but a majority had tarried in the city since the Passover. Now these frightened apostles emerged from their weeks of seclusion to appear boldly in the temple, where they began to preach the new message of a risen Messiah. And all the disciples were likewise conscious of having received some new spiritual endowment of insight and power. It was about 2 o'clock when Peter stood up in that very place where his master had last taught in this temple and delivered that impassioned appeal, which resulted in the winning of more than 2,000 souls. The master had gone, but they suddenly discovered that this story about him had great power with the people. No wonder they were led on into the further proclamation of that which vindicated their former devotion to Jesus, and at the same time, so constrained men to believe in him.
Thank you. I would like to discuss in particular one phrase from that quotation that Steve has just read for us. And this statement is midway through the second paragraph of the excerpt. This story about him had great power with the people. Now, it seems to me that the idea of a story having great power is partly a reflection on human nature. People like stories. And so the fact that people like stories and that this story had great power connects with certain aspects of human nature that have not changed in 2,000 years and probably will not change for another 2,000. But I would submit to you that in addition to the idea of liking stories, there is an important difference. Listening to a story and assenting to it intellectually is considerably less demanding than the approach to personal or individual religion that is the burden, as Charles has said earlier, of Jesus's real teachings. To carry out Jesus's real teachings about personal or individual religion requires work, it requires effort, it requires dedication. Listening to a story and giving intellectual assent is essentially what one does after dinner, especially in those days when television did not exist, when movies did not exist, when the internet did not exist. The most common entertainment of those days was listening to stories. So I wonder if the others of you would like to comment on the implications of listening to a story and perhaps explain why that story had such power with the people. Charles?
Sure. Well, first of all, oral presentations, in contrast to written ones, use many more senses. There is body language, expressions, tone of voice, the actual words, points of emphasis, and so forth. Peter was gifted at doing this. He was a natural public speaker. Only someone of that ability could sway 2,000 people. And when teachers in those days taught, they generally sat down. He probably sat to this audience of 2,000 souls. So he was able to bring to bear all of his speaking gifts to a story that was intrinsically interesting to these people who were seeking something better for their souls, for their hearts. I think that's how he was able to do this. There is a natural appeal to storytelling. I've listened to professional storytellers, and in the groups that I've attended, the smaller children gather up closest to the storyteller, and they sit down infatuated. They just bear in their with their eyes and their ears on every word and gesture. And it's extremely entertaining to listen to a gifted storyteller. And Peter was one of the best. He may have been the greatest preacher that ever lived on your rancho, for all we know. He certainly was an extraordinary one. When you take this gift and bring to bear a spiritual message, or a message that has spiritual overtones, undertones, and some substance to it, and add to that the actual experience of having the spirit of truth first come to your mind, which we can't really comprehend now, that first generation experienced. Given his gifts, the tremendous uplift that he would have felt with the presence of the spirit of truth in his mind, and his own inclinations to preach the gospel as he understood it, it is no wonder that he was able to do that then, and subsequently to many, many others.
Steve?
Well, yeah, I would go along with what Charles just said. I would like to repeat something I said previously. I'll just read a paragraph out of this book written by a great student of the early church, C.H. Dodd. He says, "For the early church, then, to preach the gospel was by no means the same thing as to deliver moral instruction or exhortation. While the church was concerned to hand on the teaching of the Lord, it was not by this that it made converts. It was by courageous Paul, not by didache, teaching that it pleased God to save men. So they had to get the message across. They had to get people involved in what the message was, body, mind, and soul. And then the teachings of Jesus could be listened to with more investment, so to speak, by the converts. But you had to get them converted in order to listen to you, because the ethical teachings and the spiritual teachings are much harder to digest, as you said. So first you feed them, oatmeal, so to speak, and then you can feed them a steak. But the oatmeal is just as important as the steak. And they realized that very quickly. The outverse of this was Abner. I'm sure Abner did not go along the path of Peter, and Abner failed in conveying the message of Jesus 100% because he disappeared within a generation. His church disappeared within a generation. So you have a choice of an attenuated message of Jesus versus no message of Jesus. I'll take this.
Thank you, Steve. I don't know if others are having this experience, but I found from time to time as you were speaking that a syllable or part of a word longer than a syllable was getting gobbled up. I don't know whether there's something that you could do with your audio settings or whether it is simply an artifact of the fact that we have connections among the four of us going in many directions, and they're not quite perfect. Bob, would you like to comment now on the idea of telling a story as opposed to imparting very deep and very challenging spiritual teachings?
I do. I always find this amazing that just one paragraph can take so long for us to kind of, at least get out the ideas and thoughts. And this one has an interesting batch here. I know we only have a couple hours here. I did mark off the very same area. The story about him had great power with the people. And I had marked off, preach the new gospel of a risen Messiah. And both Charles and Steve have said that very similar to where we've been with Peter and Paul, that to say that that the spirit of truth, as Charles brought up, which is in the last sentence there, this new spiritual endowment with insight and power. We're like fish today. We're born with the spirit of truth, or once we get our personality and thought adjuster, it just comes with the territory, so to speak. But with this, there must have been something quite extraordinary that happened, because even the midwayers were speaking of this here in this paragraph. And as they tell, stories are parabolic analogy, and there's a place somewhere in the papers where why Jesus went to parabolic analogy, parables. And I think of a parabolic analogy as a parabola or as a dish. And it doesn't matter where the signal comes in from, or where the photons, if you're going to cook something on a dish, it all gravitates to the center, and the center is the truth. So a parable or parabolic analogy lets us all come in from different vectors, and hopefully we will arrive at the same truth. And essentially stories are that bring that great power, and then add the spirit of truth. And I can see where in that upper room there, when they finally felt the spirit of truth, and then started to realize that this story really had some sticking power, that's why this all took off. But I go back to what I had said before. I probably didn't say it real well. At some point, the story then has to take on and bring in all of the, as they say, as the midwayers say in paper 195 or 196, many a pagan swamp has pulled itself into this. It's kind of wrapped around Jesus's original, very basic message about the personality of the Father. So all of that's occurring here at the same time, and it's quite understandable that this is the way that it would have taken off for the next couple thousand years. But one other thing I want to bring up about this story of, or about a cult hero, so to speak. We look at the way that we operate today in sports and in entertainment and whatever, and all of society, not just Western society, but it's now it's now a global experience that these so-called cult strong personalities can become cults, and I kind of think that that's a vestige of not only the rebellion, which up until the time of Adam and Eve, humans were without any real leadership, either spiritual or even material leadership, for a very long time, a couple 100,000 years at a minimum. And then, of course, then we had the default when Adam and Eve, who would have been great leaders and not really gone to this level. I think that kind of fulfills the gap. Add that to the fact that the story about this new risen Messiah took real hold, and there's a lot of voltage going on here, and it I almost think that this is inevitable. Steve brought up the fact Abner failed badly. Absolutely, he didn't deviate, and I think that while Jesus taught not to do this, I have to think in the back of his mind he had to lay this down, knowing that this pulling in marketing was going to take place in a very strange way. Over.
Thank you. I believe that we may have gone in some depth on this one thought, but I believe it was important to do that. Charles, I saw the line gravitate toward you. Did you have something that you wanted to add at this point?
I do, but I'll wait until we go on.
Well, then I would turn to you as the person who reads the next segment on page 90, the second half of the page, the 3 paragraphs that began what has happened all the way to the bottom of the page. This is an excerpt from paper 194.
Yes. What has happened to these men whom Jesus had ordained to go forth preaching the gospel of the kingdom, the fatherhood of God, and the brotherhood of man? They have a new gospel. They are on fire with a new experience. They are filled with a new spiritual energy. Their message has suddenly shifted to the proclamation of the risen Christ, Jesus of Nazareth, a man God approved by mighty works and wonders, him being delivered up by the determinate counsel and foreknowledge of God, who did crucify and slay. The things which God foreshadowed by the mouth of all the prophets, he thus fulfilled. This Jesus did God raise up. God has made him both Lord and Christ, being by the right hand of God exalted, and having received from the Father the promise of the Spirit, he has poured forth this which you see and hear. Repent, that your sins may be blotted out, that the Father may send the Christ who has been appointed for you, even Jesus, whom the heaven must receive until the times of the restoration of all things. The gospel of the kingdom, the message of Jesus, had been suddenly changed into the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ. They now proclaim the facts of his life, death, and resurrection, and preach the hope of his speedy return to this world to finish the work he began. Thus, the message of the early believers had to do with preaching about the facts of his first coming, and with teaching the hope of his second coming, an event which they deemed to be very near at hand. Christ was about to become the creed of the rapidly forming church. Jesus lives. He died for men. He gave the Spirit. He is coming again. Jesus filled all their thoughts and determined all their new concepts of God and everything else. They were too much enthused over the new doctrine that God is the Father of the Lord Jesus to be concerned with the old message that God is a loving Father of all men, even of every single individual. The midway is paper 194. I would like to say something on this, if I may,
right,
Neil.
Charles, go ahead, please.
The originality of the gospel of Jesus had a great substance. That's perfectly compatible, that substance, with storytelling or any other venue of delivery. It was never either or. Either you have a storytelling or a theologically strict rendition that Abner had basically proposed. Imagine Peter just as well, at least hypothetically, Peter just as well could have adhered to that originality. But he was Peter. He was caught up for a number, which I need not review, a number of reasons. He became profoundly emotional as well as spiritually sincere to save men's souls, men and women's souls. The risen Christ became Christ the Lord, the cosmic Christ. And the effect this had was to diminish the notion of personal salvation without any intervention with someone else between you and God. That was the mutation, if you will, from a religion of Jesus to religion about Jesus. Jesus used stories all the time. All the time. It really has nothing to do with so much the mode of delivery as to the substance of what was delivered. And while the concept of the risen Christ, cosmic Christ, I would say, is glorious and glorified, truly is, far greater than they could possibly even guess at the time, because they didn't know about Nebadon, of course. It is somewhat distant from the average person's purview, life, daily existence. This is why the notion of personal salvation, of personal religion, which was the main, the core of the religion of Jesus, his gospel, is so vital, so supremely important. And that became somewhat muddled. It was muddled with very good intentions, very sincere intentions, but muddled nonetheless. And when you add to that the subsequent 20 or so centuries, 19 plus centuries of add-ons of all kinds that had nothing to do whatsoever with the gospel of Jesus, nothing to do with a entirely spiritual message. Remember, the kingdom of Jesus is not of this world. It's a spiritual message, not a moral one necessarily, although it's compatible with higher morality. It's not a political one, obviously. It's and so forth and so on. It is spiritual. It's super theological. I think that's what happened, and that's why it happened. But the originality of the gospel of Jesus is perfectly compatible with storytelling.
Thank you. Steve has motioned in a particular way that you can't see since you're looking at it by telephone only. Anyway, I recognize Steve for his comments at this point.
Yeah, I would submit that it is much, much more difficult to tell a parable about ethical content. The parables that Jesus told are not simple stories. They are highly sophisticated creations, much more difficult to tell a parable with a polyvalent ethical intent, as Bob was talking about, than it is to tell a story about factual events. You know, factual events you can tell as a linear, it's a linear project. The parables that Jesus told that had ethical significance were much, much more difficult. And I really doubt that Peter could have pulled that off before a crowd of hundreds or thousands of people. I'll just say that to begin with. Second of all, the notion of individual single salvation was a very foreign concept to the Jewish people of the first century. They didn't think in terms of individual salvation. We do, but they didn't. And the reason we do is because Christianity managed to bring that into Western civilization. They only thought in terms of salvation of the nation of Israel. It's basically a tribal notion of salvation. So that idea did not come naturally even though Jesus tried to propagate it. So I think those two things are very, very important to realize. And when you look at that statement, that the proclamation that Jesus put forth, every one of those phrases is a code that these people understood based on their Jewish, on the Old Testament and on their Jewish beliefs. Each one of those they could relate to directly based on what the Torah said. So they did not make this up, just randomly. Every one of those phrases had a particular meaning to his audience. And that's exactly why it was so effective in making converts to the new religion.
Thank you. I would like to offer at least a highlight in regard to the construction of these three paragraphs. To me, they show the mastery by the Midwear Commission in developing thoughts and largely maintaining the coherence of these thoughts through a stream of paragraphs that are very rich, each individually. Now, my greatest concern in terms of the net result is focused on, especially in the last sentence of the third paragraph, that no longer was the burden that God is the father of each human being, but rather that the emphasis became that God is the father of the Lord Jesus Christ. And as a consequence of this, there was a kind of hierarchy established. God is the father of the Lord Jesus Christ. The Lord Jesus Christ established the church. The church hierarchy will tell believers what to believe. And now individuals are at the bottom of a rather long chain of authority that is intimidating. Bob, you don't have to respond to that, but please comment in any way you see fit on the implications of these three paragraphs.
I'd like to go back to something Charles was saying, because I got the Gestaltic thinking about, Charles, what you were saying is that by substituting, and I may be paraphrasing your term, so feel free to comment back if I have this somewhat different. This glorified Messiah, this gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ, almost acts as a, well, to me, it seemed like it acted as a substitute for the personal religion that Jesus was, really talking about, which is that God is the loving Father of all men. And Neil, you brought that up because I had that highlighted in the last paragraph, in that third paragraph there also. What I wanted to do, prefacing that now, what I want to do is to kind of mention something that we talked about last week, almost the very first thing, where there were these two ticks, direct personal experience with God and spiritual reality. This is where we saw the true teachings of Jesus. And then there, I think everybody realized that there was kind of an interplay between the two rather than being separate, separate and parallel and not really touching. The second one was living a life of service. All of that, and I actually added a third, but I didn't say this last week, and it's the human experience, I think, that comes out of that service. I see it as a reinforcing loop. The personal experience with God the Father, living a life of service and getting a human experience out of it and going back again. And it's this great reinforcing loop that becomes a spiral, an outward building spiral. So, I said that to go back to what I heard from you, Charles, is that it seems as though that this whole idea of the story of Jesus and the resurrection and the whole religion about him broke that chain, broke that spiral. Now, if you think there's only two, that's great. I see three in that reinforcing loop, because I think that the human experience is terribly important to get the spiritual experience. And as Jesus said, it was the fruits of the spiritual acceptance, grows into that spiritual, which is really how we see religion today. It's a spiritual experience. So all of that has to happen in my mind. And I think that was one of the conundrums that I saw out of that paragraph, and that is, it put some constraints, not only on this reinforcing spiritual, human material experience, all of these experiences aren't building up from the material to the spiritual, but substituting this whole glorified risen Messiah that, and I think it was either Steve or Neil, you said it was moving someone away from all of that. Hopefully I've sort of explained what I was thinking there. And Charles, if I heard what you said differently, feel free to correct that. Thank you.
I would like to comment before I yield to Charles or Steve for further remarks that, in effect, your explanation regarding the two ticks that we started with last week about there being essentially two elements that some people viewed as just two sides of the same thing was interesting, in that you'd added the side of human experience as part of the feedback loop or the net consequences. I would say, yes, that's true, and that your reactions in this regard, Bob, are congruent, are compatible, are evocative of your long interest in God the Supreme. That the net results of following the religion of Jesus in terms of its both elements and the reactions upon other human beings that affect them and their reactions that affect us indeed amount to a contribution to the Supreme Being's evolution. So thank you for doing that for us. Charles, do you want to jump in again?
Yes, I do. Thank you. Let me note, first of all, that Revelation, excuse me, is intended to correct a record, to restate or paraphrase or quote, expand, redirect, and lead into a new higher direction. That's the function of Revelation. It is not necessarily to make us comfortable or to be convenient to our mores, traditions, institutions, rituals, and so forth. Jesus taught the positive method, given that. We can remain focused on that. Peter was an individual, unusual man for his day, perhaps for any day, given with his gifts to extreme emotional reactions. You know, he went for the sword. He denied Jesus, even though he was forewarned. He was given to that. I find it rather charming. I identify some aspects of Peter in my own life, my own character. Some. Peter would have been served well with more objectivity. Remember that Jesus came for all of humanity as well as each individual person. And he wasn't just preparing a Jewish audience or a Jewish religion. It was for all men and women, potentially, all. And the entire world, all of Urantia. The reaction, Peter really had an overreaction to his experiences. It was just too much for him, especially when he felt forgiven. He felt the need to be forgiven. That's why he ran to see the Master. He wouldn't walk. It was typical of him to run, to rush in. And I find it somewhat endearing. But he made a fundamental miscalculation or error, perhaps not miscalculation, that's a mischaracterization. He made an error in his judgment, though. His judgment was missed the mark to a certain degree. This had nothing to do with his sincerity, nothing at all. He was completely sincere, and he was gifted. He, hypothetically at least, he was a great and natural storyteller. When I made my comment about he could have used his gift for other purposes, I wasn't just thinking of parables. There are many forms of telling a story. When I taught history, I sometimes did it in a storytelling format, although the content is backed up by a historian's research. And my students seem to enjoy that kind of an approach. I incorporate it into my natural mode of lecturing as well. I altered the traditional mode of lecturing. But I adhered to the record as best as I could, as historians have established. Peter didn't adhere to it because he got carried away, because he was Peter. He was inclined to do this. And he had this gift of public speaking better than all the other apostles. So he had the greatest influence, at least for a season. That it was very difficult for many Jewish people to relate to this is obvious and evident. However, Revelation is still about change, transformation, and growth. Change is defined as transformation, and that produces growth. And Peter, unfortunately, got so carried away that he apparently overlooked what Jesus had taught in regard to personal salvation, even though, ironically, he himself was personally saved by the Lord, by the good Lord. In any case, the next 2 millennia were partly shaped by that shift. And I think it was, in many respects, unfortunate. It has many beautiful aspects to it, but nonetheless, I think it was unfortunate. Something was lost. It has to be now corrected and restated.
Charles, your comments about Peter and your understanding of his psychology, even when he reached for a sword, makes me wonder whether you in your classroom may have kept a sword in the corner that you could use to.
Well, I once did. I had a Roman. I have a copy of a Roman Gladius. When I taught Rome, the Roman Empire, I would say, I'm going to show you the power of the Roman Empire, and I would pull this thing out and hold it up. It's a very impressive weapon.
I'm sure you just brandished it rather than applying it to any refractory student. But in any case...
I did.
Yes, all right. And the other point I would like to add, in effect, trying to link your most recent comments with those that went before, partly by you and partly by me, is also associated with the comments that Steve made before. In effect, you and I, Charles, have highlighted the originality of Revelation and Jesus's mission as a bestowal son for our planet and what he meant to achieve. In comparison, Steve highlighted the fact that any religious movement, if you wish, any religion, has to build to some degree on what went before, and that the evolution of Christianity owed some aspects to the traditions of the Hebrew people, and frankly, to the customs of the time. I think those points are coherent and they make sense. The question we have in front of us now is whether it is possible, given the Urantia book, given the revelation that the revelators have provided, to move a bit beyond and to upgrade. You commented just now that Revelation is inherently about change. And I agree with you. So the question is whether this generation or the generations that come will embody a fair amount of change in terms of their attitudes toward religious teachings, their attitudes toward God, their attitudes toward God's purposes on earth, and the fact that these purposes are complicated and are not limited to the field of theology and morals and ethics. Bob, I don't know if I've said anything. I'd like to recognize you, and I will then go to Steve again after I've heard what Bob has to say.
Well, I'm pretty well satisfied with where we are with this particular topic, Neil. I think that we've covered this ground well enough. I was going to talk a little bit about atonement, and I think I'll hold on to that just until we get down to the next section.
Thank you. That's fine. Steve?
Yeah, I just want to make a brief point about why it was so important for the apostles to proclaim the fact of the life of Jesus. The Messiah was expected. The Messiah was not, in Jewish belief, anyone who had arrived or had already appeared on the planet. For the Jewish Christians to say that the Messiah, in fact, had lived and died was extremely important at the time, because that changed the Messiah, the Redeemer, into someone who was expected but not arrived, to someone who was expected and had arrived. And that was the core of the Christian message, and that's what appealed to soon-to-be believers, that the Messiah had arrived. And that had to be spoken of in a historical, factual way. And that's what was done by the kerygma as opposed to the teachings of Jesus.
Steve, I agree with you that the concept of the Messiah was an important element to people with a Hebrew or Jewish background. It didn't have the same ring of importance to the Greek and Roman believers who came along through the through the teachings of Paul. But nevertheless, the point you have made is important. We are now going to shift to the ideas expressed at the top of page 51, at top of page 91. Before we do that, as a lead-in, I would like to quote a paragraph from a much earlier segment of the Urantia book, specifically paper 138, which is entitled Training the Kingdom's Messengers. And this paragraph, as you will see, is a specific plea on Jesus's part to stick to the message, namely his teachings about the fatherhood of God, his teachings about personal religion. This paragraph appears in section 6 of paper 138. It is paragraph 3 in that section, and now I read, quote, Jesus endeavored to make clear to his apostles the difference between his teachings and his life among them, and the teachings which might subsequently spring up about him. Said Jesus, my kingdom and the gospel related thereto shall be the burden of your message. Be not sidetracked into preaching about me and about my teachings. Proclaim the gospel of the kingdom and portray my revelation of the Father in heaven, but do not be misled into the bypaths of creating legends and building up a cult having to do with beliefs and teachings about my beliefs and teachings. But again, they did not understand why he thus spoke, and no man dared to ask why he so taught them. That's the end of the paragraph. And I would say in context that it is worthwhile to point out that these injunctions that Jesus gave were about 3 years before, at the beginning of his public message, whereas a great deal had happened since that time, specifically the events of the end of his life and the coming of the Spirit of truth and so on. So it is possible that the apostles did not remember these very specific instructions that Jesus had given at the time of the paper entitled Training the Kingdom's Messengers. Charles, would you like to react to that?
Oh, I think that's very true, and I think that's those are points well taken. The apostles again and again misunderstood him. In large part, I think, because they were projecting their own point of view and trying on what he was saying and trying to interpret what he was saying to that point of view. It's a great deal of projection. Again, very natural thing for people to do, human beings to do. Except they were ambassadors to this world. Remember, Jesus told them, he said, you ought to act as if you have already been to heaven, you've come back, in effect. That you are ambassadors. You're representing a higher reality. And to Jesus' credit, he trusted them. He picked a very diverse group with a very wide bell curve, one might say today, including the Alphaeus twins. They are a remarkable group. The problem remains, however, that we're discussing, and really two parts. It's when the birth, the seed, will determine what the tree eventually will look like to a very large extent, assuming that it has water and nutrients. But the seed does determine, to a large extent, what's the outcome is going to be, the final result. And Christianity was made a turn that it wasn't intended, that his message was not intended to go. And he did the best he could, given the material he had to work with. It's not to diminish the many fine aspects, the many fine features of what those men did, the exception of Judas and Paul. I include Paul in that statement. In a sense, Paul was the 13th apostle, in a manner of speaking, if you will. Nonetheless, the problem remains. The problem was created then, and there are possibilities for today. But the religion of Jesus, as the book points out, as one of the writers in the book pointed out, would have spread quickly if the spiritual content was adhered to. There is a difference between religion and spirituality. And the message of Jesus was spiritual. He wasn't establishing necessarily a new religion at all, but a new religion was established. And the way it was done caused the problem we are focused on, and will be focused on for some time. But it had a universal appeal. It was not neutral to culture as such, but it was something that any sincere soul potentially could relate to. I'm talking about individual men and women who wanted something greater in spiritual terms, in terms of the fruits of the Spirit, to enrich their faith, so forth, to know God better as individuals. The problem remains, and the problem continues.
I listened to you and you said, and the problem continues. I expected you to continue, but I take it you have now finished.
Well, we have quite a few pages covering many aspects of that.
That's fine. Bob, your turn.
Yeah, just one point here, and well, a couple of points, I guess, about this paragraph. Very interesting. Yes, Neil was 3 years, prior to the resurrection, for sure. So did they forget this? Maybe yes, maybe no. But the one thing I noticed about this paragraph is that there's a lot of italicized terms. And in fact, the about is italicized 3 times. I think the midwayers wanted us to get the idea about. Where I struggled in previous times, and even thinking about, that you may bring this up here today, because it's very, very relevant, as Charles brought up, is I get the about me. I don't want them to be legend. Don't be legendary. Paper 120, the recordation by Mantusha Melchizedek, where he explains, what the Jesus was being. Michael was being discussed about. What his seventh and final bestowal should actually be about. I could use that term. And certainly this was something that he really took to heart and had to tell the apostles. The part that got me was the about my teachings. Had to think about that a little bit, because let me use Charles as an example. Charles, I'm absolutely certain that you are a legendary instructor, a teacher.
My goodness.
The fact that he had a sword in his classroom probably is sufficient to establish that, isn't it?
Well, I was going to bring that up as the example. Thank you very much.
You honor me greatly, Bob. Thank you.
Well, yes. I mean, I think it's obviously true. You've taught a long time, Charles, and obviously, many of your students talked about you, and I'm sure that they talked about the legendary Mr. Olivier. But if they talk about that scepter or that sword that you brought, they're talking about your teachings rather than the substance of what you wanted them to learn about the historical. I mean, it's kind of a crude way, but they probably remember it because of that. But if they go forth and teach their children or their friends about how you did that, you lose the substance. So I think I understood that now, and that's why both of those abouts are italicized. And it's certainly not, it certainly created a very big problem for 2,000 years. And that's where we are today. Over.
Thank you. Steve?
Yeah, a couple of things. You know, at the time of Jesus, just hypothetically, let's say the apostles did go about teaching the teachings of Jesus. The first question they would ask is, where do these teachings come from? You know, what is the source? They're not going to believe some fisherman from Galilee and take their word as gospel, so to speak. They're going to want to know the source of it. So the preaching about Jesus, the kerygma, was the context, the source of the teachings of Jesus. Now, you may be upset about the proportion of one to the other, but they were both necessary. And I'd like to go back to the bottom of page 990, the last sentence that says, they were too much enthused over the new doctrine that God is the Father of the Lord Jesus to be concerned with the old message that God is the loving Father of all men, even of every single individual. Well, the message that God is the loving Father of all men was precisely Paul's message. And so it was not buried by the new doctrine. It was just added on to. So I don't see a conflict or one submerging the other, because that was Paul's message. And lastly, see if I can remember what I was going to say. No, you're going to have to come back to me. Sorry.
That's okay. I think we will want to ask you to interpret your own comment about Paul's message when we get to our subsequent discussion of the doctrine of atonement that Paul appears to have originated. I would now like to proceed on to the top of page 91, where there is a shorter quotation, an excerpt from paper 196, and asks Bob to read that paragraph for us.
Sure, Neil. Thanks. Someday, a reformation in the Christian church may strike deep enough to get back to the unadulterated religious teachings of Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith. You may preach about a religion, you may preach a religion about Jesus, but perforce you must live the religion of Jesus. In the enthusiasm of Pentecost, Peter unintentionally inaugurated a new religion, the religion of the risen and glorified Christ. Paper 196, section 2, paragraph 1.
Thank you. I think this quotation now gives me a very good opportunity, at least, to quiz you about italics, because you commented yourself, Bob, in regard to the preceding paragraph from paper 138 that I read, that there was a meaning to italics. And so in this case, we have two words that are italicized, not surprisingly at all, about, in the phrase, a religion about Jesus, and then live in the phrase, you must live the religion of Jesus. What does that word live mean in your view? And could you give an interpretation as to why the Midweir Commission italicized it?
I have to go back to the reinforcing loop that I talked about maybe 30 minutes ago or so ago. I have to, well, I'm sorry. Let me say it this way. The reinforcing loop for me has three things, which was the first tick is to do the personal relationship with the Father, and with all the spirit entities that I'm able to get, spirit, my thought adjuster, spirit of truth, Holy Spirit, so on and so forth. Live a life of service, because what that does is that gives me the human experience to be able then to evaluate, to adjust, to take my personality and to start to take in all of those cosmic things, all those spiritual things. Let me say spiritual for now. That would provide the fruits of those experiences and the fruits of that service. So for me, that's where the live italicized and I think what the Midwayers are really trying to talk about. You brought up the Supreme Being. I hadn't even thought about that, Neil, but that perforce is exactly where we're headed with all this eventually, because it's a personal universe, And, not only is, the Father the primary personality in the universe, but each of us has a personality that then has to interact with not only the Father, but with all other personalities, which will be in the universe, including superhuman personalities. So yeah, that's a very important live, and I can see that the Midwayers wanted us to juxtapose those. She may preach a religion about Jesus, but before she must live the religion of Jesus.
Thank you. I would like to revert to a comment that I made very early in our discussion today about the relative ease with which one may listen to a story. That listening to a story is a pleasant experience by itself as a cultural matter, but it's also reasonably passive. And so this takes me to the word live. To live something is not to be passive. To live something is to be active. And a religion about Jesus effectively causes people to listen to a story, admittedly an inspiring story, admittedly a consoling story, admittedly a spiritually inspiring story, at least we hope so. But listening to a story, even appreciating it, even accepting it, is predominantly passive. Whereas living the religion of Jesus, doing something in one's life, consecrating one's life to the spiritual realities that he was portraying, and attempting at least to carry them out in our lives, is not passive. It is active. Steve, I have given you perhaps an entry point here that you might like, but you might like some other entry point, so please feel free.
This is a fine entry point. There's been much written, as you can imagine, about the parables of Jesus. And one of the main aspects of the parables of Jesus was that it demanded active listening. If you could not listen passively to the parables of Jesus, you had to get involved in the story in order to understand the story. And that goes back to a Hebrew word called mashal. Mashal was another word for parable, but it meant story that took you out of yourself. In other words, you had to transform yourself in order to hear the story correctly. And that was very true about the parables that Jesus told. Now, the stories that Peter told, I think to a lesser degree, were the transformative in that way, but certainly a Hebrew mashal or a Jesus parable was a transformational listening experience. So I'll disagree with you on that. I'd also like to reread the sentence that we've been talking about, and I submit that the wrong words are italicized in the sentence. So I'll just read the sentence and I'll make a slight change. You may preach a religion of Jesus, but perforce you must live the religion of Jesus. So in other words, there can be a discontinuity whether you preach a religion of Jesus. If you don't live the teachings, it doesn't matter whether it's a religion about Jesus or a religion of Jesus. If you don't live what you're saying, then it doesn't matter. So the key word that should be italicized is you may preach. The difference is between preaching and talking. And so talking versus walking the walk. So living is walking the walk, preaching is talking the talk. So it doesn't really matter whether it's about Jesus or of Jesus, you've still got to walk the walk. So I would just make that comment as well.
I think we should interpret this as an application on your part to be an editor the next time the Midwayer Commission writes something.
Okay, I'll take it.
That you have a better idea for where italics should be applied than they do. Charles, would you like to come back on this?
I do. I think it will be instructive, and that is useful and worthwhile, to define the two prepositions about and of. And I'll comment briefly. The preposition about is defined as follows: around the outside, close by, near, almost, here and there, moving from place to place. In other words, it's secondary, which means indirect. The preposition of is, first of all, what is known in grammar as a primary word. I'm sorry, a function word that is primary. Primary means direct. Secondary, indirect. Primary, direct. So it's a function word. Describe as a function. About is not described as a function word, but the preposition of is a function word. And it may be defined as follows. Indicates origin, cause, motive, content, the whole, W-H-O-L-E, the whole of something, the component material. In other words, Peter and many of his fellows, and then subsequent, the next 2,000 years approximately, at least in Peter's first generation, maybe second, third generations, in many respects, they were extremely close to the mark, but they still missed it. Hence the emphasis, the consistent, repeated emphasis by the midwayers of differentiating those two prepositions and the importance of differentiating those two prepositions. I would retain them. Unlike my faithful colleague, Stephen, I would retain this differentiation. I think it's conceptually valid to do that and necessary to do that because it describes what actually happened. They were about the religion of Jesus, and they missed the mark, irrespective of how close they were. Still missed the mark, and the problem remains.
Thank you, Charles. Your entry point into grammar, in effect, triggers my personal relationship to translating from English to French or French to English. And in many cases, the word of corresponds to possession or ownership. Something belongs to someone. And belonging can be simply an artifact of owning, or it can be an artifact of identity. I think in this case, religion of Jesus is identity. The religion that he proclaimed, the religion that was associated with him, the religion that he embodied, the spiritual values. Steve, I saw your finger move up.
Yeah, just very quickly. What I said about that sentence has nothing to do, I believe that, like Charles said, there's a substantive difference talking about a religion about Jesus versus a religion of Jesus. I'm not disagreeing with that. I was just talking about that particular sentence and that the differentiation is between preaching religion and living religion. Had nothing to do with not saying there was a difference between about and of. So I just want to make that clear.
Thank you. In effect, what you're saying is preaching, by definition, regardless of the contents of what is preached, is different from living. And I think that is a point that I certainly agree with. Bob, would you like to come in again?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think I understood this, Steve, when you first brought it up. Very, very well said. And, maybe rather than edit what the midwayers have, maybe you just add another sentence in there next time.
I can do that.
I think we are not in the league of the midwayers for expression. I believe that there is a useful point here in terms of all our joking about possibly editing. This is not a perfect document. It is a document written by spiritual beings who did their best for us. But in various points, not just the Midwayer Commission, but the other revelators stated that it is an imperfect document. They have done their best. They were struggling with the need to express their ideas in English, whereas English is not the native language of any of the revelators. And in one very pointed paragraph, the author of that paragraph states that the factual scientific ideas presented in the fifth epical revelation are limited by their permission for revealing ideas that either were already known or sorting them out, and that the cosmology of these revelations is not revealed, that it is limited. And I think we also have to bear in mind, or should bear in mind, that the ability we have as a group of four, extending to all readers of the Urantia book, does entail the right to interpret, does entail the right to have a personal relationship to the teachings. We are not being given something on a plate that we must swallow whole. We are entitled to express our opinions. And indeed, as I commented earlier today, the principle of pluralism and diversity is right at the heart of these discussions that we are having. Charles, I saw your light flickering, but I wonder if you would allow us just to go on to the major question number 60 in the blue box. Is that okay?
By all means.
All right. I read this question, one of the formal questions that are contained in Revelation Revealed. It is actually number 60 in the course of the document as a whole. We can all join the Midware Commission in hoping that a reformation in the Christian church will someday cause at least some denominations thereof to concentrate on the unadulterated religious teachings of Jesus, rather than continue to focus their faith and observance on teachings about him. G, the importance and meaning of the events that occurred on Christmas Day, Good Friday, and Easter Sunday. Do you see any objective evidence that seems to point in this direction now? If you are willing to look well into the future, what do you predict? Charles, I will yield to you as the first person to answer this formal question from the text.
It's a formidable question. It's formidable because it's interesting, and it's even colorful in some ways, but necessary. Because one of the domains we should address always and think about is destiny. Origin, history, the nature of something, and destiny. So it's important to raise it. I gave a lot of thought to it, and I'm not satisfied with my response. I do have a response, and I'll relay it, but I'm not altogether satisfied with it. It's an exceedingly challenging question because of the adjective objective. It's difficult for me to be objective when I love Jesus personally, as my friend and as my Savior and as my King, King of Kings, the captain of my salvation, in whom all things consist. So it's objectivity. I want it to succeed. That's why objectivity is difficult. Not necessarily impossible, just difficult, because I want it to succeed. On the other hand, I want to be correct, but not necessarily mean the same thing at all. To want something and to be correct about it can have a considerable distance. So, notwithstanding this potential pitfall, which might be a pitfall, let me offer the following ideas. I coined a phrase, the leverage-potential, the leverage potential. The leverage potential of the Urantia book, I think, is superior to anything that's been written heretofore on Earth, on Urantia. And this book, this revelation, this presentation is on an epical or planetary scale, yet it's sufficient for an individual, any individual, hypothetically at least, to relate to, if he or she wants to approach it that way. I think it has a leverage. I think it's valid to suggest that the Urantia book has a leverage potential over all other human records and human presentations and human experiences. The world's great religions, and I studied them, and I have taught about them, and as best I could. Being a public school teacher, I may not actually do religion, but I'm allowed by the appellate courts to teach about it. So I think the leverage potential is there. I think that has some validity. Secondly, I'm not convinced that Christianity, it may have it, but I'm not convinced it has the moral and spiritual power potential to be sufficient to answer the great issues and questions that humanity has to come to terms with, such as where are we going? There's a tremendous amount of confusion on that. Why are we here? What is the point of human existence? We've had 20th century has been fraught with some wonderful achievements, but also some terrible, terrible things. I think humanity's spiritual need is very deep, and much deeper than we could comprehend, but it's extremely deep. We can't see the bottom or the top or even the sides. God can. Michael can, but we cannot. But I think it's very deep. It's an assumption. I think it's a valid assumption. But the Urantia book, I think, has a depth and a scope, or a scope and a depth, we would say, to meet a great deal of that. Certainly the religion of Jesus can meet it. Another idea. There is a great response potential with regard to Jesus reconceptualized, re-understood, and approached in a living manner as a friend, as a comforter, and as a guide, spirit of truth. But as a friend, an actual friend. Now there's a few specifics, and I'll close my remarks. For many years, the Vatican has been sponsoring quietly talks between Eastern and Western religions. I've often wondered how much of that goes on, that kind of activity goes on we're not aware of. I know it happens. I know it, objectively speaking, it happens. And I've read some comments by some of the participants, including Dalai Lama. The comments were positive and regarded these talks as affirmative, as useful. A Christian bishop in Africa was asked why Christianity is so popular, so appealing in many parts of Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. And he said it's 100% about Jesus, and much less, if at all, about anything else. It's all about Jesus. And the Urantia book has a leverage potential in the life and teachings of Jesus, unexcelled, in my opinion. So I offer that as possible evidence that hints toward something, a future, a destiny. And the religion of Jesus, when it's presented, must be presented in a non-Western, with a non-Western image in the East. It must be presented with a planetary image, a global image, a epical or apocal image, somehow. The Urantia book must be, first and foremost, we students and readers of the book that shaped our lives to some extent in a real manner, must remember it's the Urantia book, the Earth book, and that's our cosmic designation. I still submit that the Thought Adjuster papers, when the Thought Adjuster is really understood, it'll save this world. And when people know and begin to understand why we're known as the world of the cross and why we're a shrine of the whole universe, but the Thought Adjuster concept, that makes, in a certain sense, concrete the idea of God's love, God's knowledge of us, and the relationship to the divine spirit, in a sense, much more concrete. That we have a divine. It explains what people have known to exist, the still small voice. But it explains it in a way that, for the first time, we have a really clear explanation as to how we're going to adjust our thinking, adjust the mind, human mind, from between time and eternity. There is a divine instrumentality specifically for that. And then that we have something to offer in return, personality. Those concepts, the Thought Adjuster and human personality and divine Thought Adjuster, and the relationship between them is so powerful that I would predict that it will triumph in the end. I'll close with that.
Charles, your answer presents me with a dilemma as the moderator. You began by praising the question, which I feel very pleased with because, after all, I wrote the question as the author of the document. And then you put forward quite a range of very interesting observations. I would say the center of your observations has to do with the potential of the teachings of the Urantia book in various dimensions to affect the world. But as far as I could tell, you studiously avoided answering the question that I asked. And I think if you were at a news conference answering a question supposedly from a journalist, your reply might have been construed as a filibuster. So I have to go back to you and wonder whether you will really venture a specific answer to the question, or whether you would be content by saying it's too soon to tell. And that, I think, would be a reasonable reply if you choose to give it.
Well, as I said, I'm not entirely satisfied with my response so far. But I think it will. Are you willing to look into the future, and what do you predict? I believe that it's the objectivity of the evidence that is the challenge, to discern and locate evidence objectively. To be objective, you have to have some kind of perspective that a certain distance in time and space provides. And I'm afraid the reporter will just have to be either frustrated or annoyed and go home.
That's
but
fine.
I'm not. My intent was not to avoid, but rather I'm not yet. The question is very towering, very difficult. It's formidable, as I said. It's a formidable question, and to have objective evidence. Evidence is not simply hearsay or opinion. It's evidence. And there are examples of the spiritual hunger of the world. The World Parliament of Religions is another example. How many times this happens on Earth? How many of these go on between a few individuals and many? I don't know. But it has happened. And my guess is there are other things happening to foster an affirmative response to that question. But as to objective evidence, that's a tall order.
Thank you. I think I would offer, at least in a very preliminary sense, an appraisal of your response as not proven. And this phrase, not proven, actually comes from the law in Scotland, which differs from the law in England, which is the source of common law in the United States. In the United States, and likewise in England, our forebearer in a legal sense, there are only two verdicts that a jury can render: guilty or not guilty. In Scotland, the jury has a third alternative, not proven. And I think that third alternative, not proven, would be a reasonably fair way of characterizing your response to this question. Do you see that?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Steve, it's your turn.
Okay, a couple of things. I will present some objective evidence, believe it or not. But I have a problem with the word unadulterated religious teachings of Jesus. There is no such thing outside of what Jesus actually said in the moment. The New Testament is not unadulterated. The Urantia book is not unadulterated. So they've both gone through various processes of interpretation, selection, and translation. So I dispute the notion that there's any such thing available to us, or there ever will be available to us, the unadulterated religious teachings of Jesus. That's number one. Number two, as far as objective evidence goes, I think there is some in the positive, to indicate in the positive. I'm getting a notice here, my internet connection is unstable. How's my voice?
Right now, it's working fine. I did have some issues with you before, not with you, but with your voice.
Okay. Anyway, they do these studies studying the behavior, the ethical behavior of religious people versus non-religious people. And I'm not sure if it has to do with Christians per se, but just in terms of religious people in general tend to have a more empathy and basically a better quality of moral behavior than non-religious people. This is on the whole. Okay, this is not talking about anecdotes or individuals. This is on the whole, and So I think that religious teachings of Jesus are realized not in dogma, not in statements, and not in religious observance, but in the everyday life of religionists. And so, in other words, how you treat your fellow human being on a daily basis. So that's where the religious teachings of Jesus are either proven or disproven, supported or not supported. So you just have to look at the everyday life of people, and the evidence seems to indicate that not only synchronically in our current time do religious people have a better ethical quality of life, but over time, going back decades and centuries, the overall ethical quality of human beings, believe it or not, has improved according to historians. Now, you can't do a study on that, but this is the, I guess, the summary observation of many historians, that the average human behavior, quality of human behavior has improved over the centuries. So take that as you will.
Thank you. I think now, in turning to Bob, I have to offer him a semantic variation on the question. Steve has objected to the word unadulterated. So Bob, if you prefer to take the slightly different meaning and substitute adulterated religious teachings of Jesus rather than the unadulterated religious teachings of Jesus, you are free to answer the question from that perspective. But of course, you may say whatever you like, and you are certainly free to comment on something that Charles may have said if you wish. So over to you, Bob.
Thank you, Neil. I'm getting worried you're a mind reader, because that's how I approach this. Yes, sorry to be funny about it, but that's exactly where I was headed with this. To understand what the unadulterated were, or might be, what are the adulterated? So I looked up the definition, like I've been doing in these webinars in the past here. Adulterated means render something poor in quality by adding another substance, typically an inferior one. So, an example of that, a very simple example, is that the meat was ground fine and adulterated with potato flour. Okay, so synonyms are like impure, degrade, debase, spoil, taint, contaminated. So, can teachings be adulterated? Well, that's what the midwayers are telling us, is that someplace on this planet, hopefully on this planet, well, someplace, let's say, unadulterated, Jesus's unadulterated teachings exist. So is that in the Urantia book? Well, the midwayers tell us that their editors have already performed human thought, or thought that's already been established. So does it exist someplace in books that are sitting on shelves gaining dust someplace? So I thought, okay, well, let me come up with some things. So, I did a little bit of rereading again to try and really understand what I felt was the unadulterated, but I did approach it to the adulterated. I said, okay, well, what would be some of these adulterations? So let me just throw out a quick list here. Number one in my list, of course, is atonement. The infallible Pope and the infallible Bible. Hell, holiness of the church, the day of judgment, original sin, baptism as a requirement for admittance to the kingdom, and absolution of original sin. Jesus as the eternal Son, the second person of Trinity, intercessory prayer. I'm sorry, I put those two together. Jesus as the eternal Son, i.e., the second person of the Trinity, intercessory prayer, virgin birth, deism and theism together, male ordination only, subordination of women, biblical law related to marriage, and divinely authorized worship format. Now, many could disagree with many of the things I have on there, so I just offer them from my perspective of what I felt was adulterated. So let me leave that, because I know we're running over a tad here. I still am not exactly sure where the unadulterated teachings would be. So as Charles said, I found this question to be very difficult because, I had to do some research to make sure I understood what this might mean, at least what the midwayers are telling us. And second, the thought came about, well, where would these unadulterated teachings be? And is the only place the Urantia papers? And I think not. And we can talk about that a little further. But I have two examples of this. The second question, or the first question says, do you see any objective evidence that seems to point in that direction? Yes, absolutely. And I want to mention two pastors. One was an evangelical. Actually, both were pastors of these very large mega churches, they call them. One was Carlton Pearson, and he believed he had received an epiphany from God. He stated publicly that he doubted that the existence of hell as a place for eternal torment. Well, if hell is one of the adulterated teachings, we're seeing some that I presume that's a data point that there's some evidence. However, the outcome of this is that he lost his church. He lost the mega church. He went bankrupt. People left. Lots to talk about that particular outcome. And then the other one I mentioned was Rob Bell, who was another mega church pastor, is being condemned for questioning the existence of hell also. So they're both at least at that level. And of course, he's still, he's a great speaker apparently, and he's taking his controversial message to Bible Belt areas, going right into the beast of the belly, or I should say into the belly of the beast. And he's being called a heretic. So if those are two good pieces of evidence, data point, that's the direction it's going. And by the way, with the Rob Bell, there was a pretty good article that I had found about that. The millenniums are kind of the audience that he's reaching at this point. So, and I think we brought that up earlier. What will this new message be? How will it be delivered? Well, if this is a direction, then I think that that's some pretty good objective evidence that while it's only two small data points, it's a direction finder, I think, or a pointer.
Thank you, Bob. I would take this opportunity in my capacity as the moderator to point out that we have not quite reached the 2-hour mark of streaming.
No.
The streamings didn't start until 12 minutes past the hour, at least by the clock on my desk. But in addition to the complications about adulterated or unadulterated, I would point out that for the purposes of any monolingual speaker of English, nothing in the Urantia book credited to Jesus consists of words that he actually spoke. Jesus did not speak English. The English language did not exist in Jesus's day. Jesus was most probably, in most of the contexts that the midwayers quote, speaking Aramaic. He might have been speaking Hebrew at certain points with a religious significance. He might have been speaking Greek at the point where he was talking with persons who were not Jewish, or who might have been from Greece or from some other part of the Roman Empire inhabited by people who were not Jewish. But in no statement ascribed to Jesus was he speaking English. He could not. It was impossible. And so if we take that linguistic aspect into the word adulterated or unadulterated, we have another dilemma. The Midwear Commission has translated. They had to translate. They had to translate anything spoken by Jesus or any person living in his day into English from the language that he, Jesus, or another speaker like Rodin may have used. So the question of adulterated or unadulterated, in my own personal intentions as I wrote the paragraph, as I wrote the question, had to do with the theological accretions and additions, more or less along the lines that you, Bob, mentioned. Some of the doctrines and teachings that crept into Christianity that Jesus did not teach. And so the paraphrase of the question identified as question 60 is whether or not the observant Christian denominations will go back to the essence of Jesus' spiritual message, abandoning many aspects that became affixed to Christianity by this process of extemporizing that we paraphrased earlier as they made it up as they went along. And I think, frankly, we have not reached a conclusion about whether the organized Christian denominations will ever be able to do that, or whether any of them will ever be able to do that. I teased Charles that his answer could be considered a filibuster, but that was really just a statement of the fact that he had walked around the question by citing many examples of indications in a spiritual sense, in a religious sense, that probably will be favorable. And I would say that the most favorable central point that Charles identified is this revelation, the fifth epical revelation, the Urantia book. Now we really have reached the 2-hour mark, and I have a dilemma myself, because the bottom half of page 91 introduces the question of sacrifice and atonement, a profound topic, and I believe it would be a disservice to our readers even to launch that. So I think now, gentlemen, it is best to thank you for a very interesting and I would say invigorating discussion. If I perhaps came at any of you too aggressively, then I am sorry that I did, but I thought we had an extremely worthwhile discussion today. And those are my concluding remarks. I invite each of you to say something if you wish. Bob?
Yeah, I really appreciate the revelation revealed, these open-ended questions. You can see that they are quite pointed and in many cases stimulate different kinds of thinking. And I've learned from every time that we get together here, I learn something new from my partners on the panel. So Stephen, Charles, and Neil, thank you very much. Appreciate this.
Charles, concluding comments?
Well, you were a very good anchor, Neil. You needn't apologize. It never occurred to me to be offended by anything you said. I'm always impressed with a direct, straightforward statement. In any case, well, objective evidence is elusive right now, so it's not proven, not yet proven.
Thank you, Steve. I yield to you for concluding comments and, frankly, the last of the program today.
Very enjoyable discussion. This dovetails very well with my current studies in late Judaism and, late Temple Judaism and early Christianity. So very grateful for this opportunity to participate in the discussion.
We're grateful to you, and I extend that gratitude also to my partners, Bob and Charles. So goodbye for today. We'll see you next week.
Okay, goodbye all.
Adios, amigos.
Adios.